Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for coming for this very special event, the first official halaqa or event of the Usuli Institute, which is sort of, the formal name is the Institute for Advanced Usuli Studies, but more affectionately we refer to it as the Usuli Institute. And it's really exciting. This is actually, it's exciting at so many different levels because we've really been talking about this for so many years, and we now have nonprofit status, so we can start making it really an official endeavor. But in honesty, it's really kind of a continuation of a life's work and what we really have been doing for most of our time together, which is focusing on elevating knowledge and raising awareness as to this really beautiful, rich tradition, and you know, trying to teach people about this school of thought, which is not about Islam being one way or another, but really a methodology for finding beauty and reasonableness, and finding a way to bring that into your life. And so I'm really excited that you're all here, and I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about kind of the background and how we arrived here, and just also personally what this means to me, because it's it's a very personal thing for me. I actually was a convert before I met the professor, and I came to the faith through books. Really, I hadn't met many Muslims. I was at business school. I was getting my MBA at business school when I learned about Islam through some classmates. And interestingly, I really had not met many Muslims, never went to a mosque, didn't really know anything about the reality of Islam in America before I converted. And once I converted, then I actually went to the mosque for the first time and was introduced unknowingly to Wahhabi Islam. And so for a year, I was very much unknowingly immersed in this very, conservative culture where I was told that I had to wear hijab and that I shouldn't interact with men, I shouldn't ask questions, that Islam was a very easy black and white faith, and that, all of the stuff that everyone hears at the mosque these days, and that has really turned people away. And being new, I had done a lot of studying, but I really just didn't know anything about the reality of, Muslim life in America. So I was very quiet about it and just kind of played sponge and tried to take it all in. And it was kind of funny, at that time I was fresh out of business school and I was doing my corporate marketing job at Johnson & Johnson during the day, and then at night I would go to the mosque. And so I had this sort of double life where I was like normal in the day, and then at night I had to kind of be what I perceived a right Muslim to be. And so after about a year of that, I was very fortunate to receive as a gift for my conversion a set of lecture tapes that were the professor talking about hijab, actually, about Muslim women jurists in Islamic history. And so I received these audio cassette tapes, and I popped them in my car, and I used to listen to them driving to and from work. And I discovered three things. One is that I was really intellectually oppressed and stagnated from that year of being at the mosque and not being able to question, not being able to think, or kind of getting the message that you shouldn't use your brain. And then secondly, being completely blown away by this person's approach, which was, we were given an intellect, we were expected to use it. Let's look through these case studies of Muslim women jurists and what they were able to achieve in their lifetimes, and let's reflect on what does this have to say about our condition today and the position of women at that time throughout Islamic history. So it was a really interesting and fascinating thing. And lastly, quite frankly, I fell in love. So I was like, oh my God, I have to find out, where is this person, and is he teaching? Because I have to learn from this person. This is what brought me to this faith, and this is what made me fall in love with Islam. This was really the theology and that I fell in love with that spoke to my heart. So I found out that he lived 10 minutes from me, and subhanAllah, and got in contact, and then the rest is history. But so it's been actually an amazing journey, because I feel the incredible blessing and privilege and honor of having learned an Islam that I think most people are unaware of. And it's grounded in knowledge, and it's grounded in sophistication and beauty and nuance. And quite frankly, I don't know if I would be Muslim today if I had not met the professor and had the opportunity to have my husband be someone I could turn to, and every time I would see something crazy or that I didn't understand, or oh my gosh, explain this to me, that I got more than an explanation. I got a whole history and a context, and and something that really was like, oh, okay, I get it. And those experiences, and even seeing him interact with people, were extremely empowering and extremely confidence building for me and my faith. It made me feel like, okay, I made the right choice. And that not only does Islam have an answer for some of these things, even if it doesn't have an answer, it has a means of getting to an answer. So it's that idea of following this methodology of, is it beautiful? Is it reasonable? Is it something that's humane? Does it, eliminate suffering, or does it lessen suffering? And so over the years, it's like I feel so blessed to be able to say, like, without any hesitation, that this faith is amazing and it's beautiful, and if people only knew what I know and what I've seen, they would come in droves. And so I recognize too that this blessing was really not for my own edification or my personal enjoyment, but this was a responsibility that God gave me. So I feel that, for me, like, this effort with the Usuli Institute is part of my giving back. I have to testify to what I had the privilege of seeing and learning, in my place as, partner to someone who is so incredibly knowledgeable and beautiful. So that's, it's extremely personal for me. And so I'm very grateful. And I'm so excited that all of you are here. I mean, we've invited a lot of different people that we've come across in different situations. And I think that the one thing that really pulls all of us together is this idea that, there has to be more. I mean, we meet people all the time who are very lonely, who believe that there is a beautiful Islam, that don't really see it anywhere. And then once they actually are exposed to some of the professor's writings, some of his lectures, some of his classes, they're like, oh my gosh, they had that same feeling that I had, which was like, fresh air to a suffocating person. And so that's, what I think brings us all together. And we all know that Muslims are in crisis, that we have people that are leaving the faith. We have our kids and our grandkids who, we seriously wonder, are they going to be Muslim? And what is Islam going to be like? We have a 12-year-old son, and I worry about what's going to happen. What's Islam going to be like when he gets older? And, I think it's a real concern. Is Islam even going to be around? Are we going to be extinct here in America? So, this was a chance. I think people are always asking, what can I do to help? How can we make a difference? How can we really counter all of the craziness in the world? And I think in that spirit, that's what this effort is about. And, we hope that, if you like what you hear, us talking about, the professor's going to talk about the Institute, that you will take it on as your personal cause. Not to be a scholar, but to do whatever you can, whatever your strength is, whatever your gift is, just spreading the word. If you know people who have money, and they want to invest in making a difference, this is a great way to do that. If people have, for me, I'm not a scholar, but my strength is in marketing, communications. I do the website, I do the administration work. That's my way of adding and even, just building a bridge. So, I can help people who are not scholars understand, the importance of this thought or why it makes a difference for all of us. So I wanted to also say a few words about this backdrop. If you've never been to our house before, this is our home. This was our home for 20 years before the books completely took over. But it's, it's the centerpiece of the professor's book called The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books. And for those of you who are not aware, it's an amazing book that is short stories that each chapter is, a unique story about a problem that, it's about life as a Muslim in America, basically. And it's people who have come to Sheikh Abou El Fadl to ask, how do I solve this problem? And this problem could be related to marriage, to your relationship with your parents, to your faith, to the craziness you see at the mosque. In each of these, particular cases, the professor convenes late in the night, convenes a conference in the library, which is this library, and has a conversation with the intellects in this library. So each book is like an intellect that's been preserved over time for all of eternity. And so you have all of the Islamic jurists here who have a gazillion different opinions about everything. So it's kind of like that rabbinic tradition where you have 10 scholars, but you have 20 opinions. But I think for Islam, it's probably even more so. And the whole premise is, how do we solve this problem in the most beautiful way possible? Because when we're seeking the divine, we're seeking the most beautiful way. And God is beautiful, and God loves beauty. And so this is really the whole backdrop for this effort too. And we really want people to see, like we have this used to be our living room, so it's now library stacks. We have, literally every single wall, and even upstairs and out, we have a huge garage, and we had to buy a little, storage shed. Everything is just books. But this is, our life work to preserve the Islamic tradition, because that's what we're about. And that's, I was really surprised, I think, when I was a convert, that, that appreciation for knowledge was really not part of many born Muslims that I've met. And I think that's really the key to going back to our roots, reclaiming what's beautiful, and not just carving a space for ourselves. Because I think the point is not to say, okay, we're in America, let's just all get along and just give us this little spot for Muslims and tolerate us, we'll be fine. No, I mean, we have a moral message for all of humanity, and I think that that's what this effort is about. So for the rest of our session, we'll try to finish around 5 o'clock. The professor will talk about the Institute and more about what, whatever the professor wants to talk about, obviously. And then we'll open up to a Q&A. And then whoever wants to stay around, I'm just going to order some pizza so we can all hang out afterwards. If you don't have to rush off, then please stay. And a lot of this is also community building. So I'm sorry, we sent around a sign-up sheet, and it said, please indicate if it's okay if we share. I didn't mean that because we're going to sell you like products or anything. I just wanted to create like a sign-up sheet where if people wanted to get in touch with each other, that they could. So that's really it. Because I think so much of this is just addressing that loneliness and bringing people together on common grounds and feeling like you belong to a community. So that's, part of what we're doing. So please shut off your phones. Just a little housekeeping. And then the last bit is, I said this at one of our previous sessions, which is when we do a Q&A, one of the most beautiful things that the professor said to me shortly after we met was that there's no embarrassment in religion, and that no question is off limits. So when you ask questions, feel free to ask anything that you normally wouldn't feel comfortable asking anywhere else, because this is for the sake of knowledge and for the sake of our faith, and there's nothing more important. So that's it. So welcome, and thank you for giving me this.
Thank you. Well, first, I welcome you. I'm honored that I know some of you have come long distance, and I'm honored that you are in the library. We actually don't live here anymore because the books have taken up all the space, and where we do live, the books are encroaching there as well, with no end in sight. Grace spoke so eloquently that she should teach the halaqa, and I'll say something about why the Usuli Institute. I, by nature, I was part of being anchored in the tradition in which I grew up. Is that what is grilled in you is an ethic of self-effacement and the rejection of the egotistical I. That you don't put yourself forward as a source of knowledge. You don't claim even originality. You have a deep sense of reverence for knowledge, for ilm, and a deep sense of reverence for teachers and the sages who taught you. And so even when we would formulate an idea, it is so ingrained in your consciousness to give credit to your teachers and to give credit to those who educated you rather than claiming it for yourself. And this, of course, in the United States has its own ways of unfolding, because we, among Americans in the United States, there is a very different ethic where people often claim knowledge where they don't have it, and the egotistical I is highly inflated in a way that goes to the other extreme. So for a very long time I resisted, despite the urgings of Grace and Sharif, resisted the very notion of coming forward with any type of organizational structure or even speaking about a school of thought that would in any way be attributed to me. What has changed? What has changed is that we Muslims, in our particular moment in history, in our particular place, we are confronting a sentiment, a prevailing sentiment that I find among all Muslims, including myself, with our children, with our grandchildren, with a generalized sense of defeatism. I mean, we have to speak frankly and honestly and say that there is a general sentiment that we all share, and our children share, a feeling of being beaten down, a defeatism where we are constantly put in the posture of having to explain ourselves, explain our terminology, explain our norms. And the efforts at trying to claim the power for self-definition, those efforts that do exist among efforts where institutions have been created by Muslims and so on, there's a systematic, consistent problem. Any nation in the world, a measure of where it is in history is what type of people does it put forward to define itself. And if you look at the history of the Prophet ﷺ, was the genius of the Prophet was not necessarily just what he as a human being taught, but the people that he inspired forward, the ability to elevate the cream of the crop and to put talents where they belong. All of us have been created with particular abilities, and the challenge is to be able to have the right ability at the right place at the right time. So if if you have a nation in which engineers pretend to be doctors, and doctors pretend to be historians, and historians pretend to be economists, and economists pretend to be bankers, it's a failing nation, by definition. If each of us becomes self-referential, if each of us says, we only accept what our own senses and consciousness allow us to accept, we only believe what our senses can touch and perceive and hear, and nothing beyond that, the whole edifice of a social structure and the whole edifice of an educational structure breaks down. We human beings, in fact, are social animals. Everything we know is based on the Quranic concept of ta'aruf, or coming to know the other. Self-reference in itself is an arrogance that often comes from a deep sense of insecurity. You don't trust, and because you don't trust, you become self-referential, because you do not feel safe yielding any of your own autonomy to the authority of another. But in reality, that's how we form relationships. That's how we form marriages. That's how we become brothers and sisters. That's how we form parental relationships. Through a mechanism and a dynamic of trust in which you ultimately relinquish a part of your own authority to another on the basis of trust. But we have a crisis in this sense in our current Muslim community. And all of this is to say why I finally agreed to the idea of the Usuli Institute and agreed to doing what scholars don't like to do, and that is to become activists. Scholarship, by its nature, it thrives in isolation and thrives in silence. Noise and an abundance of stimuli is very counterproductive for scholarship. If you cannot isolate yourself in silence and you're constantly have your senses bombarded. So I agreed to the Usuli Institute not because I want to lead the Usuli Institute. I want to inspire the Usuli Institute, and my dream is to have others lead it and for me to withdraw. But it has to be anchored on an ethic that, whether you want to call it a school of thought, you want to call it a madhab, you want to call it an approach, it doesn't matter. So why the Usuli Institute, and what is the idea behind it? Well, first, the name itself, Usul. Partly, this is a reference to history. In Islamic history, there has always been an intellectual conflict that has gone up and down throughout Islamic history between those that see the role of God as if a king on earth, and those that see the role of God as if a figure that ultimately empowers but doesn't directly rule. And this is a little bit of heavy theology, so I'm going to try to go slow, bit by bit. The idea of theocracy, although today we think of it in purely political terms, is actually a very, very old idea, and it goes back to Judaism and the Old Testament, the idea of the divine as having direct rule over human beings, and human beings having primarily the role of obeying the divine and nothing else. This school of thought mines the tradition, it investigates the tradition for the rulings of the divine. In other words, for what the divine commands, and its main job is to obey. And it's as simple as that. What is the divine ruling on X? Once you have the divine ruling, the next challenge is submission, and the thoroughness of submission, and the purity of submission. That's a systematic and a very old approach to the divine will, to what God wants. The Usuli, what has become known as the Usuli orientation in Islam, sees the role of the divine as a deputizing role. The divine has sovereignty in an absolute sense, but the divine inspires human beings to rule themselves, rather than the divine ruling them on every point. Now, do we need God? If the answer, after all these years of reading, the answer, in my view, is that without God, all normative ethical structures ultimately fail. Every philosophical justification for a system of ethics without the existence of the divine ultimately, in my view, ends up to be philosophically flawed. Now, I won't get into that because we could spend hours and hours just on the philosophy of that. Now, at the same time, we need God, but God doesn't need us. What God ultimately does for us is to inspire in us an initiative, an energy, if you will, a momentum that we fulfill and ultimately are held responsible for before God in the hereafter. It is a deputizing, it is an agency, it is as if a charge, a divine charge for a human being to excel and become. But ultimately, you believe and you have the conviction that when all is said and done, you will be judged. And if you don't really believe that, then we have a serious point of departure. Then we don't agree on the very ABCs. Human beings, when they do not believe that they will ultimately be judged, are capable of doing remarkably, horrendously ugly things. And justifying, as the Quran says, human beings have a remarkable ability to justify intellectually anything to themselves, and to philosophize it, and to legitimize it. And if human beings ultimately think that this life, this mundane life, we live it and we are done with it, and there is nothing beyond that, we see exactly the type of division of wealth, the type of exploitation of human beings, the type of remarkable Machiavellian pragmatism and ethics that pervade our world, and that has become the system under which we as human beings live. So the usul is that we constantly return to foundational, epistemological, if you will, philosophical, if you want to call them moral foundations. But ultimately, these moral foundations enrich the human being, unlock the potentialities of human beings rather than suffocate the potentialities of human beings. And one reality about so much of Islam today is that the way Islam manifests, the way Islam is practiced, it suffocates the potential, the potentiality of a human being rather than unleashes it. We come to Islam, Azhar just issued, the Dar al-Ifta in Egypt issued a statement that the matter of hijab is close to discussion. Hijab is a religious obligation. Anyone who is not doing this committing a kabira, and this matter is close to discussion, and no further discussion is allowed. Unfortunately, that's the common culture for today's Islam. Unfortunately, whether you are talking, if you're a Muslim and you have a creative impulse and have an autonomous impulse, if you want to achieve yourself in music, if you want to achieve in art, if you want to achieve in thought, in philosophy, in theory, you are always standing at the cusp of illegitimacy, the way Islam is practiced today. I mean, it is as if we come to Islam and we are told the divine will defines for you the following space, bracketed within boundaries, and yet you must perform within these boundaries and nothing else. Well, that kills the human being. That suffocates the human being. And if this was Islam from the beginning, if this was the Islam of the Prophet ﷺ, Islam would have died centuries ago. And in fact, this is not an issue of Islam, but it is the issue of an Abrahamic faith. From the time Allah endowed or gave Ibrahim, والسلام, the Prophet Abraham is pronounced. It is, and this is a very long subject, so the problem with knowledge is that you can easily go on any point and go on for hours, right? The potentiality created in a man such as Ibrahim, and I'm just going to summarize a great deal of amount of material. From Ibrahim to Moses to Jesus to each prophet becomes a richer human being, and each figure that within the Abrahamic message is not suffocated as a person. Their life and does not become about the perfection of ritualism, but becomes enrichment of humanity itself. Take, for example, Jesus in the temple. Jesus has, and I'm aware that many of you might not know a lot about the narrative of Jesus, but Jesus ultimately condemns the practices in the temple because of how embedded they are in ritualism and how embedded they are in privilege. The priests of the temple in Jerusalem had become anchored in a system of privilege that they perpetuate through a steady practice of ritualism. And Jesus comes and is exactly what we can call speak truth to power, and challenges that power structure and challenges the comfort by which ritualism makes people think that they are good with God. Now, Jesus doesn't live long enough and the conditions of his age, he doesn't lead a rebellion himself, although after he's dead, 70 years later, there is a massive Jewish rebellion, which the Romans suppressed very violently. But the difference between Jesus and Muhammad is that Muhammad, his historical circumstance, allowed him to in fact lead a rebellion against the same ritualistic statism that Jesus and Moses condemned before. In other words, we have the same divine message in which the human beings are empowered to look within and condemn privilege that spills into injustice.